I trusted her with everything I owned. That's the sentence that plays in my head every single morning when I wake up. Not I loved her or I was fooled, but specifically that I trusted her with everything, because I did. Desmond here, 63 years old, and I spent 35 years as an automotive engineer in Detroit designing transmission systems for performance vehicles, building a car collection worth over $400,000, only to watch a 26-year-old woman use my registration documents to borrow $215,000 against vehicles I didn't even know could be used as collateral in Thailand. The cars are gone now. Most of them. The ones I spent decades finding, restoring, protecting. Gone because I kept the paperwork in a filing cabinet she had access to, because I trusted her, because I'm an idiot who thought love meant sharing everything. I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan in the 70s when the American auto industry was everything. My father worked on the assembly line at Ford, came home every night smelling like metal and oil, and I worshipped that smell. By the time I was 14, I was rebuilding carburetors in our garage. By 16, I could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. That obsession carried me through engineering school at Wayne State, through 3 decades at various automotive companies, through a marriage that lasted 9 years before my ex-wife admitted she couldn't compete with my true love, which was cars. She wasn't wrong. I loved cars more than I loved her, more than I loved most people, and after the divorce I doubled down on that love. Started collecting seriously: a 1960 Shelby GT5, a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, not replicas, real machines, numbers matching, documented provenance. I'd travel to auctions, spend weekends at car shows, invest every spare dollar into finding and restoring classics that would appreciate over time. By the time I retired at 60 in 2021, my collection was worth approximately $420,000, stored in a climate-controlled garage in suburban Detroit, and represented more than just vehicles. It represented every success, every smart decision, every bit of discipline I'd maintained over 40 years. Retirement hit me harder than I'd expected. Without the structure of work, without the daily problem-solving and engineering challenges, I felt unmoored. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning out of habit, realize I had nowhere to go, and spend hours in the garage just staring at the cars. Beautiful machines, perfectly maintained, and completely useless sitting there. I started thinking about driving them, really driving them, not just to car shows but across continents. I'd read about Americans shipping classic cars overseas for rallies and tours, and the idea took root. Why not drive my collection somewhere it would be appreciated, somewhere the roads were open and the weather was warm year-round? Thailand kept coming up in the research. Established expat community, decent roads in the major cities, thriving car culture among wealthy Thais who appreciated American muscle cars. I could ship the collection over, spend a few years enjoying them, maybe sell them to Asian collectors for a premium when I was ready to come home. I flew to Bangkok in January 2022 to scout logistics. The city overwhelmed me initially, the heat, the traffic, the density of it all, but I found my footing at a car meet in Thonglor that a contact had told me about. Wealthy Thai collectors showing off Ferraris and Lamborghinis alongside carefully restored Japanese classics, and when I mentioned I had American muscle cars I was thinking of bringing over, interest was immediate. Several collectors gave me their contact information, invited me to private events, treated me like I was someone important because of what I owned. That validation felt incredible after months of retirement isolation. These people understood what I valued. They appreciated the same things I did. Yupa was at that car meet working as a translator and appraiser for one of the wealthier collectors. She was 26, spoke perfect English, and knew more about classic car valuations than most Americans I'd met. When I told her about my collection, she pulled up auction records on her phone, knew exactly which models I was describing, could quote recent sale prices from Barrett-Jackson and Meckham auctions. She worked for her family's business, she explained, which dealt in high-value collateral lending, cars, jewelry, property, and she appraised vehicles for authenticity and market value. I was impressed. Most women I'd met in the States had zero interest in cars, treated my hobby as an expensive waste of time, but here was someone who understood not just the vehicles but their financial significance. We started talking regularly after that first meeting. She'd send me photos of cars that came through her family's appraisal business, ask my opinion on values, pick my brain about American muscle car markets. The conversations were professional initially, but they warmed over weeks into something more personal. She asked about my marriage, my retirement, what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I asked about her background. She'd grown up in Bangkok, studied business at Thammasat University, learned the appraisal trade from her father who ran the family lending operation. She'd dated a Thai man who'd been controlling and dismissive of her career, and she'd ended it because she refused to be with someone who didn't respect her intelligence. I liked that. I liked talking to someone who was ambitious and knowledgeable and took me seriously. By March, I'd decided to ship 3 of my cars to Bangkok: the Shelby, the Cuda, and the Camaro. Their total value approximately $285. The logistics were complex and expensive, but Yupa helped navigate the import regulations, connected me with a shipping company that specialized in classic cars, even arranged for climate control storage in a facility her family had connections with. She charged me nothing for this service, said she was happy to help because she loved cars and wanted to see my collection in person. The cars arrived in May, and when we went to inspect them at the port, seeing the Shelby roll off the container truck onto Thai soil felt like vindication of everything I'd planned. Yupa walked around each vehicle taking photos, pointing out details to the customs officials in Thai, handling the bureaucracy I couldn't have managed alone. I rented a condo in Thonglor near the storage facility, and Yupa started visiting regularly to check on the cars, to plan which events we could show them at, to discuss potential buyers if I decided to sell. The relationship shifted into something romantic sometime in June. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. We'd be sitting in my condo talking about a car show coming up, and she'd touch my arm while making a point, and the touch would linger, and suddenly we were kissing. She moved in by July. Didn't ask, really, just started staying over more nights than not until her clothes were in my closet and her toiletries were in my bathroom. I was 62, she was 26, and I'm aware how that looks. But it didn't feel predatory or transactional. It felt like two people who'd found common ground in an unlikely place. The first time she asked for money was August. Her younger brother needed 45,000 baht for motorcycle repairs after an accident. About $300. I gave it without hesitation. Family helping family, that made sense to me. 2 weeks later, her mother needed dental work, another 60,000 baht. Then her father's business needed a short-term loan to cover a cash flow gap, 180,000 baht that would be repaid within the month. Each request came with apologies and explanations and promises that this was the last time, that things would stabilize soon. I gave the money because I had it, because I cared about Yupa, because helping your partner's family seemed like what you did in a relationship. The money was never repaid, but I didn't push. I'd read enough about Thai culture to know that family support flowed in one direction, from those who had to those who needed, and repayment wasn't always explicit. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Yupa had been photographing my car registration documents since June. The paperwork was in a filing cabinet in my condo office. Import documents, Thai registration certificates, insurance policies, everything organized the way I'd organized project files for 40 years. She'd have access whenever I left for errands or gym visits, and she'd been systematically documenting everything. The registration certificates in Thailand list the vehicle's specifications, the import dates, the current owner, and critically, the estimated value for customs purposes. With those documents plus her family's appraisal business credentials, she could establish value and ownership chains sufficient for collateral lending. I didn't know any of this. I thought the documents were just bureaucratic paperwork, useless to anyone but me. By October, her requests for money had become more frequent and larger. Her brother needed surgery this time, 120,000 baht. Her sister's husband had lost his job and needed help with rent, 95,000 baht. Her father's business was facing some regulatory issue that required legal fees, 200,000 baht. I'd given her approximately $18,000 over 3 months, but I was starting to feel uneasy. Not suspicious exactly, just concerned that I was becoming an ATM rather than a partner. When I suggested she should ask her family to be more financially independent, she became emotional. Said I didn't understand how Thai families worked, that it was disrespectful to refuse help when you had the means to give it, that she was embarrassed to even have to ask me, but her family was in genuine need. I apologized, told her I'd keep helping, told her I understood even though I didn't, not really. An expat I'd met at a car event, an American named Bill who'd been in Bangkok for 8 years, pulled me aside in November and asked point-blank whether I was giving Yupa money. Word had gotten around apparently the expat community in Bangkok isn't as big as you'd think, and people talk. He told me he'd seen the pattern before. Young Thai woman, older Western man, family emergencies that never seemed to end, money flowing out with nothing to show for it. His advice was simple: keep your finances completely separate, never give cash you can't afford to lose, and for God's sake don't put anything in her name. I told him my situation was different. Yupa worked, had her own career, came from a legitimate business family. She wasn't some bar girl looking for a sponsor. She was educated and professional and genuinely loved me. Bill just shook his head and said he hoped I was right. The transformation in Yupa's behavior after she got access to the car documents was subtle enough that I didn't connect it to anything specific. She became less affectionate, spent more time on her phone, had more evening meetings with her family about business matters she couldn't discuss. When I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was stressed about work or family issues or the political situation in Thailand. All plausible, all reasonable. I gave her space, assumed she'd open up when she was ready. What I didn't realize was that she was coordinating with her family's lending operation to establish loan terms using my vehicles as collateral. The process apparently took months, verifying authenticity, establishing market value, drawing up loan contracts in Thai that named the vehicles as security against cash advances that would go to various borrowers her family worked with. December came and went. I'd been in Thailand for a year, had spent approximately $35,000 supporting Yupa's family, and was starting to think about whether this was sustainable long-term. My retirement savings were healthy, $580,000 in investment accounts plus the $285,000 in vehicles, but I wasn't generating income anymore. Living in Bangkok wasn't cheap when you factored in rent, insurance, supporting a girlfriend and her family. I sat down with Yupa in January 2023 and suggested we needed to talk about finances, about creating some boundaries around family support. She agreed easily, said she'd been thinking the same thing, said her family understood they couldn't keep asking for money. She was convincing. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She'd never given me reason not to. The discovery came in February through the most mundane circumstance imaginable. Bill, the expat who'd warned me about financial boundaries, called and said he'd seen Yupa at a pawn shop in Hoi Quang, a district north of where we lived. He'd been driving past, noticed her through the window, having what looked like a serious conversation with the shop owner, thought it was odd enough to mention. When I asked Yupa about it that evening, she said she'd been appraising jewelry for a client, that pawn shops were part of her regular business rounds. Made perfect sense. I didn't think about it again until Bill called 3 days later and said he'd seen her at a different pawn shop in the same area, and this time he'd been curious enough to watch for a few minutes. She'd been showing paperwork to the owner, and from what he could see through the window, it looked like vehicle documents. I went through the filing cabinet that night while Yupa was visiting her parents. The car registration certificates were all there, but they'd been moved. I'm obsessive about organization, engineer's habit, and the documents were in a different order than I'd left them, filed behind the wrong dividers. Someone had gone through them recently, and hadn't put them back exactly right. I took photos of every document, then called a Thai lawyer the next morning to ask a hypothetical question. If someone had vehicle registration certificates, could they use those to secure loans without the owner's permission? The lawyer explained that Thailand's collateral lending system relied heavily on documentation rather than physical possession, and that particularly with high-value items like classic cars, lenders would accept registration certificates and appraisal documents as sufficient proof of collateral. The actual vehicles could remain in storage while loans were issued against their value. It was legal, he said, as long as the borrower was acting with the owner's permission. I confronted Yupa that evening. Didn't yell, didn't accuse, just asked directly whether she'd been using my car documents for anything related to her family business. The look on her face told me everything before she said a word. Panic, then calculation, then resignation. She admitted she'd borrowed money against the cars. Not much, she said, just short-term loans to help her family's business through cash flow problems. The loans would be repaid soon, she promised, and the cars were never at risk because her family controlled the lending operation. I asked how much. She said 2.5 million baht total, about $72,000. I asked which cars. She said all three. I asked when she'd planned to tell me. She didn't answer that. The rage I felt wasn't hot. It was cold and precise and controlled the way stress calculations are controlled when you're designing a transmission that has to function at 500 horsepower. I told her to leave the condo immediately. She started crying, saying she'd done it for us, for our future, that her family's business needed the capital injection and the loans would be repaid with interest and I'd actually make money from this. I told her again to leave. She said I didn't understand how Thai families worked, that this was normal, that I was overreacting like a typical Farang who couldn't understand local business practices. I picked up her phone and threw it against the wall. That shut her up. I'd never been violent before, not in 63 years, and the shock of my own actions stunned both of us. She left. I spent that night going through every document in the filing cabinet, cross-referencing dates and details, building a timeline of what she'd done. The loans had been issued starting in September, just a month after I'd given her first family support money. 4 separate loan contracts with different borrowers, all using my vehicles as collateral, all structured through her family's lending business. Total principal was actually closer to 3.1 million baht, about $89,000, with interest rates that suggested the borrowers were higher risk. The Shelby was collateral for 1.4 million baht, the Cuda for 1.1 million baht, the Camaro for 600,000 baht. None of the loans were in my name. They were in Yupa's name or her family members' names, structured so that the cars were security against loans that had nothing to do with me legally. I hired the lawyer the next morning and laid out everything. He read through the contracts and explained that Thai law would view this as a civil matter rather than criminal fraud, because Yupa could argue she had implied permission to handle the documents as part of our relationship and her professional appraisal role. Proving she'd acted without my knowledge would be difficult without recordings or written exchanges where I'd explicitly denied permission. The vehicles themselves were still legally in my name and still in storage, so technically they hadn't been stolen, just encumbered with debt I didn't authorize. The lawyer's recommendation was to try to negotiate repayment of the loans before they came due, because if the borrowers defaulted, the lenders, Yupa's family, had legal claim to seize the vehicles as their collateral. I called Yupa's father, a man I'd met twice socially and who'd seemed respectful and businesslike. I explained the situation calmly, said I was aware of the loans against my vehicles and needed to discuss immediate resolution. He claimed he didn't know the loans involved my cars specifically, said Yupa had handled the documentation, said it was unfortunate, but the loans were legally binding and the borrowers had already received the money. When I asked about repayment, he said the loans had 6-month terms and weren't due until March and April. When I said I wanted the vehicles released from collateral immediately, He said that would require paying off the full loan amounts since the borrowers wouldn't agree to release security while the loans were active. When I asked what happened if I refused, he said very politely that Thai law allowed creditors to seize collateral when loans defaulted, and while he hoped it wouldn't come to that, he had fiduciary responsibility to the borrowers who'd taken the loans in good faith. The trap was perfect. I could pay $89,000 to release the vehicles from loans I'd never authorized, or I could wait for the loans to mature and hope the borrowers repaid them, or I could refuse to cooperate and watch my cars get seized legally when the loans inevitably defaulted. The lawyer confirmed this was accurate. Yupa's family had structured everything carefully enough that challenging it in Thai court would cost more than the loans were worth and would take years to resolve. The fastest solution was to pay the loans off myself, take the loss, and get my vehicles back under my full control. I didn't have $89,000 liquid without selling investments at a loss. The markets had been down, and pulling that much would lock in significant losses on positions I'd planned to hold long-term. I had about $42,000 in accessible cash between checking accounts and an emergency fund I'd kept in BAT. I could cover the rest by selling the Camaro, which was the least valuable of the three vehicles and would bring maybe $50,000 from a quick sale to a Thai collector I'd met at events. I hated it. Hated every part of it. But the alternative was risking all three vehicles, and I couldn't stomach that. What I'd discovered next made the $89,000 in fraudulent loans look almost trivial. When I went to the storage facility to document the vehicles before starting the sale process, the manager mentioned that Yupa had been by several times over the past months, sometimes with other people, showing the cars to potential appraisers or buyers. I asked what she'd told him, and he said she'd presented herself as co-owner and had authorization to discuss potential sales. He'd thought nothing of it because she knew security codes and had keys I'd given her for legitimate access. I checked the visitor logs. Yupa had brought 7 different people to see the cars between October and January. 7 potential appraisers or buyers, building a network of interest around vehicles she intended to help her family seize. I sold the Camaro to a collector in Bangkok for $48,000, well below market value but the fastest deal I could close. Combined with my liquid cash, I had enough to pay off the loans against the Shelby and Cuda. I met with Yupa's father at his office with my lawyer present, presented bank transfers totaling 3.1 million baht, and demanded immediate release of the vehicle encumbrances and all documentation showing the loans were satisfied. He accepted the money professionally, provided signed letters releasing the collateral, and even apologized that the situation had become complicated. No acknowledgement that his daughter had committed fraud. No offer to return any portion of the money beyond the legal requirement. Just business, conducted politely, as if stealing a 63-year-old man's car collection was a minor misunderstanding. Yupa tried to contact me multiple times over the following weeks. Text messages saying I'd overreacted, that she'd been trying to help, that I'd humiliated her family by involving lawyers and treating them like criminals. Voicemails crying and saying she loved me and couldn't understand why I was destroying what we had over money that I'd get back eventually anyway. One message said she was pregnant, which I knew was impossible because I'd had a vasectomy 20 years ago after the divorce. The lies just kept coming, each one more desperate than the last, each one revealing how little she'd ever actually known or cared about me. The total financial damage came to $126,000. The $89,000 in fraudulent loans that I'd paid off, the $37,000 loss on selling the Camaro below market value, plus approximately $18,000 I'd given her directly for family support over the 6 months before I discovered the fraud. None of it was recoverable. I could have pursued criminal charges, but the lawyer explained that would require proving intent to defraud, would take years in Thai courts, would cost tens of thousands in legal fees, and would likely result in minimal punishment even if successful. The Thai legal system wasn't set up to protect foreigners who got scammed by Thai nationals in civil financial matters. I could spend years and more money fighting, or I could cut my losses and leave. I shipped the Shelby and Cuda back to the United States in March 2023. The cost was $14,000 for both vehicles, another hit to savings already devastated by the fraud. I left Thailand in April, flew back to Detroit, moved back into the same suburban apartment complex I'd lived in before retirement. The garage where I'd stored my collection welcomed me back, and I put the Shelby and Cuda in the same spaces they'd occupied 3 years earlier. Everything was the same. Except I was $140,000 poorer. I'd lost the Camaro, and I'd spent 14 months being systematically robbed by someone I'd trusted completely. The Camaro is apparently somewhere in Thailand now, owned by a collector who got a hell of a deal. Yupa is still in Bangkok, still working in her family's appraisal business. I found her on social media recently. She's in a relationship with another Western man, looks to be in his 60s, and there are photos of them at car shows with what appears to be his Porsche collection. I thought about sending him a message warning him to keep his documents locked up, but what would I say? That I'm a bitter ex who got scammed because I was stupid enough to trust someone? That's exactly what he'd hear. Just another jaded Farang with a grudge against Thai women. He'll figure it out on his own, or maybe he won't, or maybe her family has refined their approach enough that they won't need to steal from him the same way they stole from me. I'm 63 years old. I have $440,000 in retirement savings, down from $580,000. I have 2 classic cars instead of 3. I live in Michigan, where winter makes driving classics impossible 6 months of the year, where the car culture is nostalgic rather than vibrant, where every show is full of men my age talking about the good old days that aren't coming back. I don't date. I don't trust anyone enough to let them into my home, much less my financial life. The cars sit in the garage under covers, and I visit them maybe once a week to start the engines and check fluid levels, but I don't drive them much anymore. What's the point? The thing that haunts me isn't the money, though that hurts. It's how completely I was played. Yupa knew exactly what I valued, exactly what I was insecure about, exactly how to position herself as the one person who understood my passion for cars and treated it as legitimate rather than childish. Every conversation about vehicle values, every discussion about car shows, every moment she seemed genuinely interested in my collection, all of it was research. Figuring out what mattered most to me so she'd know exactly how to take it. I stored the car documents at home in a filing cabinet I'd used for 40 years, in a system I'd trusted completely, and that casual accessibility became the mechanism of my destruction. That's my fatal flaw. Not that I fell in love with someone younger, or that I moved to Thailand, or that I trusted a romantic partner. My fatal flaw was believing that the organizational systems that had served me well in engineering would protect me in relationships. I treated my personal life like a well-designed transmission, thought that if I kept everything documented and organized and in the right place, nothing could go wrong. Instead, I built her a roadmap to everything I owned. People who haven't been through something like this don't understand the rage. They think you move on, chalk it up to experience, learn from mistakes, and rebuild. But the rage doesn't leave. It sits in your chest like a physical weight, cold and dense and permanent. I'm angry at Yupa for stealing from me. I'm angry at her family for facilitating the theft. I'm angry at Thai legal structures that enabled the fraud. But mostly I'm angry at myself for being so spectacularly stupid, for ignoring warning signs, for choosing to believe someone who was lying from the moment we met. The $126,000 is gone forever. The Camaro is gone forever. The life I thought I was building in Thailand is gone forever. I'm back where I started 3 years ago, retired, alone, spending too much time in a garage with cars I'm afraid to drive because something might happen to them. The only difference is now I know that the person who will hurt you most is the one you trust completely, and the things you protect least carefully are the things someone will take first. If you're reading this and you're thinking about shipping your possessions overseas, about building a life in Thailand with someone you've just met, about sharing access to documents and assets, because that's what partners do. Stop. Lock everything down. Keep financial records in places no one else can access. Don't assume good faith. Don't assume love protects you. Don't assume your expertise in one area translates to wisdom in another. I spent 35 years designing transmissions, and I couldn't see that I was being set up for a theft that would cost me over $100,000 and a car I'd spent years finding. The Shelby GT500 is worth maybe $180,000 now. The Cuda is worth $150,000. Together they represent most of what's left of my collection, and I don't touch them much anymore. They sit in climate control gathering dust, appreciating slowly in value, reminding me every time I see them that the Camaro should be there too, that all three should be there, that my mistake was thinking trust and love were the same thing. They're not. Love is what you feel. Trust is what you risk. And I risked everything for someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of collateral for her family's business operation. I'm 63 years old and I don't know what happens next. The rage hasn't faded and I don't think it will. Some betrayals don't heal, some losses don't get recovered, some mistakes don't offer redemption arcs where you come out wiser and stronger. Sometimes you just lose, and you sit with that loss, and you try not to hate yourself too much for your role in it. That's where I am. That's where I'll probably stay.